the aim of the panel that we're now going to convene is really begin to unpack what social and emotional skills are in the context of early childhood and what really influences their development. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Sophie Mort, a leading clinical psychologist and mental health expert at Headspace, Neil Leitch, an inspirational driver of change in early childhood care and education, Beverley Barnett-Jones, a national expert in social care policy and practice, and Ashley John-Baptiste, an award-winning broadcaster and TV presenter. So warm welcome to everyone. No pressure, just having followed Lord Hague and Sir Tony Blair. But really picking up on some of the topics they discussed and what we heard this morning, it really feels like relationships as one of these domains appears incredibly important. And I wonder if you could maybe start us off, Sophie, by maybe unpacking some of the skills that we believe might underlie this domain.
Absolutely. So we've heard a lot this morning about how important relationships are. But we haven't actually heard what skills we need to teach children or have actually in ourselves in order to have good relationships. So the listening project showed that there are many, many skills to learn. I'm only going to give you 4 because we're not here all day. The first one is perspective taking. The ability to see any scenario from multiple different perspectives, to consider different beliefs, experiences, and viewpoints. Another one is empathy. I think Lord Hague did a really excellent job of describing what that means, so I won't go further into it. Another one is the ability to form attachments, to actually be able to bond with people in a way that is healthy and sustainable. And the final one I'll mention is conflict resolution, the ability to deal with difficulty. Now, everyone in this room, you will have different levels of skills in each of these areas, and this will dictate really how your relationships are. And we've started learning these skills from the moment we come into the world, depending on who related to us, what warmth they showed us. And positive social and emotional experiences in the very early stages, before we can teach those skills in a concrete way, involve showing a child that they are safe. Physically, but also in the relationship. You aren't suddenly going to disappear. It involves making that child know that their emotions, their internal world is understood. And it's about soothing them when things get difficult. Remember, we've said it's not about protecting the child from any stress. It's about showing them how to navigate this. And if you had each of those things, you had a really good shot at the relationship domain. But as we're going to go on and see, not everyone has that. There is one thing I would really like to say here. I often work with parents who listen to talks like this, and they come away and they're like, oh my goodness, I've got to do this perfectly, but the other day I lost it in front of my child, and now I've ruined everything. Well, firstly, they're human, they're going to make mistakes, but actually every time we make a mistake, we have an opportunity. If we can pause and say, I wasn't proud of that thing, I'm incredibly sorry. It happened because I was feeling, insert feeling here. What I'm going to do in the future to make sure that doesn't happen again is this. You've given your child an opportunity to say, you know what, I can make mistakes going forwards. Relationships can fall apart and actually come back stronger afterwards. So you don't have to get it perfectly right.
In fact, it's probably not good to get it perfectly right because it doesn't really prepare us
right.
for our own relationships and colleagues and how the world actually is. So that's actually quite helpful. But it's, as you say, Sophie, the capacity to learn. And Neil, I wonder then, thinking about the context of learning in very early childhood, what your experience has been about how we foster those relationships right from the earliest years.
Can I just start, Eamon, in terms of Lord Hague's comment about empathy? I have to say that his final comment to me this morning when we were having a discussion was, remember, Neil, you're only as good as your last gig, which didn't feel empathetic to me. And then as I was leaving home this morning, I have to say my wife said to me, good luck, darling, it's all going to be fine. And then she followed it with, call me when it's all over, just to make sure you're still alive. So
Moving on.
I felt I had to start with something slightly lighter because I think if you work in my world, there's no ambiguity about the importance in terms of developing relationships. And I just wanted to share with you what that looks like in reality. And I'm not trying to imply that this is just a normal everyday occurrence, but it is an occurrence, an example that stuck with me, and it will stick with me forever. The Early Years Alliance is a membership organisation, but we also operate 42 settings in areas of deprivation. And I was visiting a particular setting a couple of years ago. And when I go to these settings, I quite like to travel by train, walk to the setting. It's my form of physical exercise. On this particular occasion, the manager said to me, "I'll pick you up, Neil. Let me pick you up." And she was really, really insistent that she drove me in the car to the setting. So I relented. She picked me up. And in the car journey, for the 10, 15 minutes, all she talked about was, "Neil, we've got some really vulnerable children at this setting. We've got some really disadvantaged families, etc., etc." And I'm thinking to myself, I came from a dysfunctional family. I was raised in a care home. I left school when I was 14. And in an arrogant way, I was thinking, I've seen it all. You're not going to stun me or shock me. So we arrived at the setting, went out into the garden, and there was a little boy following us around all the way through. And the setting adjoins a school, and there was a very low fence. And on the other side of the fence, there were two, I assumed, reception class teachers. And this little boy, who was standing alongside us without any context, just looked up at these two teachers, and he said, "You effing bastard bitch." I apologise, Your Royal Highness, for the language, but it's relevant. And you could see that the manager was incredibly embarrassed. I, frankly, was pretty stunned. And we went back into her office. And she told me that this little boy had already been excluded from 2 preschools.
And how old is he again? He's
3 years
3
of age.
years old.
3 years of age.
Incredible.
And she said, "I am not prepared," her words, "to put him onto the scrap heap." And she talked in such loving terms of this little boy. Then she told me that 6 weeks earlier, his dad had brought him into the reception area, and we have this small couch in the reception area. And he climbed up onto the couch, and she said to him, "Alex, come down from the couch." And she held her arms out. He grabbed her arms, he pulled her in, head-butted her in the face, and he broke her nose. And still, she talks with such loving, loving terms of this child. She tells me that his father, she told me at that time that his father let him stay up until 10 o'clock in the evening watching inappropriate programs. She said that she spends her life developing relationships with this child and also giving him more and more one care than she would ever give, I suppose, under normal circumstances, because parents constantly say to her, "You keep that child away from my child." She then went on, so relationships isn't just about children. She then went on to say, "I need to work with a family because there is little gain if we give good experiences to children in this environment and then we send them home to chaos." So relationships are absolutely critical when it comes to the early years. But I think, final point, if I may, Eamon, that is that I think it would be disingenuous of me if I did not say that at this particular point in time, we run the risk of removing the opportunity from our educators to spend time, develop one-to-one, attachment, because we have people leaving in droves. We have a recruitment and retention crisis that we've never witnessed before because people are exhausted, they feel undervalued and underpaid. Tony Blair, when he was sitting here, back 20 years ago, in 2003, there was an initiative that was launched, and many people I'm sure will remember the term, that is, Every Child Matters. Well, I would just say in 2023, so do the people that care and educate those children.
It's a very, very powerful story. So thanks to, and that's what's so striking about that is how by the age of 3, adults around a child can potentially, who excluded him previously, were seeing a problem located in the child. The child had a problem and setting up a whole trajectory where there was going to be fractured relationships and displacement and a life of potential that would be unmet. And the role that the teacher played that you described is just extraordinary in potentially changing not just that child's life, but all of the children's life that she comes into contact with. So how do we support those relationships, and how do we see beyond the behaviour that the child is presenting with to look at the systemic factors, to think about adversity, trauma, poverty, and the structural factors that might surround how we can have relationships with children? And Bev, I know this is very central to your own work and experience.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Neil, for sharing that insight. And yes, you know, my own practical experience, I've seen many children and heard many children in these circumstances, but I want to just put a marker around the importance of not pathologizing family or pathologizing child. The context of poverty, deprivation, combining with other social adversities are in the environment around families and impact on the environment they can create for their children. So for me to land the great ambition around emotional and social needs, we can't treat poverty as the wallpaper that's not noted, because it's dynamic, it's active, it impacts, it affects the individual journeys, as does other adversities such as racism. So for me, you know, if we are going to land this, we have to think about where those interventions are going to be. I take on board the wonderful presentation from Dr. Jonkov this morning, which really illustrated that we have to tackle those social factors, those adversities in the environment, to create the opportunity for families who are in their own lived experiences struggling with histories around abuse, neglect or trauma that might be generational, to receive then the interventions that would work, and those interventions being disaggregated. So some work for some and some work for others, and not a blanket idea that all we need to do is take a group of people, put them in an intervention program, and here we go, we're going to get some changes. It doesn't work like that. And I've been around in the practice space for 30 years as a social worker to know that doesn't work in that way. So yes, there is a real need to recognise the issue of the responsibilities that we hold as families and the care we give to our children, but the context is that children and families live in a community. Many of the community for families is an environment that isn't safe. The built environment isn't safe. And we have to really challenge that at the same time as then have the prospect of sort of landing children into that wonderful place we want them to be, you know, where they really get that opportunity, you know, to thrive and to take the opportunities when they're there and to develop the resilience and the wonderful things Sophie sort of talked to us about. So,
Thanks, Bev.
That's it for me.
And so, as I know that you previously shared your own story and your own experience growing up also in care, and I wonder if you might share with us your insights into the role of relationships and how they affected you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's my childhood, my lived experience that's really shaped my outlook on these issues. My mum was 17 when she had me. She was a victim of abuse. She didn't have the agency to look after me. So at 2 years old, I was placed into foster care. Between the ages of 2 and 18, I was shunted between 4 different foster families. I also spent time in a care home. So that's 5 moves, 5 moments of trauma, 5 moments of rejection, feeling abandoned. I can't remember the first home that I lived in because I was so young, but the second home was it was wicked. At 4 years old, I was sent to live with a lovely Caribbean lady who I thought would be my forever home. Phone dropped, lovely, little icebreaker. I thought she'd be my forever home, but at 8 years old, she decided to let me go. And there were no words to articulate the sense of abandonment and rejection in being told at 8 years old that your foster mum doesn't want to look after you. It was a really tough childhood. And here we are talking about, you know, those all important, you know, early bonds. They were completely broken for me, completely shattered. And perhaps it's not surprising to say that that start affected my childhood. So I wasn't aspirational. I, you know, struggled at school for a long time. I didn't trust adults because the adults I knew let me go. And so it was tough. I was grappling with the immediacy of survival. But from there, you know, I went on to get a good degree. And of course, I'm now a BBC broadcaster. And I suppose there's a question of how did that happen given that really tough start? And I would say that there were really significant individuals who at really critical times began to intervene and steer me towards a more positive path. One example I want to touch on is at 8 years old, I was sent to live in a care home. And there was an incredible key worker, and he wouldn't mind me saying his name, Lyndon. Lyndon was really unique and significant because in that home, none of the boys went to school. But Lyndon forced me to go to school. And at the time, I despised him, to keep it real. I despised him. But every day at 7 a.m., he would force me to get up and go to school. If he wasn't on shift, he'd call up the home. And this was a remarkable intervention. He was so persistent that school became the norm. But what that going above and beyond action said to me was that he cared, he saw my potential, and he was invested in me. And that's a really key example of, despite the broken bonds that some kids may encounter, it's possible to have individuals intervene and steer you on a more positive path.
That's really incredible, Ashley. Thanks for sharing. And I think it just really communicates so powerfully just how critical relationships are in the sense of us feeling valuable as human beings, or feeling that we matter, and that's just the fundamental requirement for building a life. And just listening to all of you, it really strikes me the way in which we're not just talking about parents here, we're talking about social workers and key workers and teachers. And it really strikes me, Sophie, that what we're hearing is the importance of a collective effort when we think about the early years.
100%. We really have to realize that parents, caregivers, teachers, support workers are doing their best, often in very difficult conditions. And how can a parent or whoever's supporting that child give the child everything that we know that they need if they don't have the support that they need in order to be well? If they don't have the time, the resources, and sometimes even the safety to keep the child and themselves surviving, let alone thriving. For too long, I think we've placed too much onus on one person, one parent, one caregiver. We've forgotten, I know it's already been mentioned here today, the idea that it takes a village to raise a happy child. It's more than a village. It's communities of people who can be kind, who can offer empathy, who are generous with their time. Environments that are safe, but also have the resources that families need. This is how we provide the scaffolding in which a family thrives. So if we want happy and healthy children, this is a collective effort, and it involves, even if you just have 5 minutes, say, you know what, love, sit down, I'm going to make you a cup of tea. If you have longer, saying, you have a nap, I'll watch the baby. Or if you're in a position of power where you can really shape society and get resources to where they're needed, that is something that you can do. There's something all of us can do. And I know this, I'm going to get a bit cheesy right now. I just really want to say, it's so exciting we're all here. Let's do this.
And I think that will bring us to this afternoon where we're going to start thinking about what we can actually do and formulate some concrete actions. So we really look forward to those discussions. I'm conscious of time, and I'm wanting to move on to another domain, and maybe one that some of us may not have automatically thought would be in one of the 6 key domains of social and emotional development, and that is the one around Explore the World, which is really about imagination. And imagination is a uniquely human phenomena, and we're in the Design Museum. It couldn't be more apt that this is a place which is all about imagination and creativity, and our capacity to think of things that don't yet exist, things about ourselves, things about the world. And I'm going to turn to you again, Sophie, if that's all right. If you could maybe unpack just briefly how you see the core skills that underlie this domain of imagination, exploring the world.
So I'm going to give you 4 things. We've got creativity, the ability to generate new ideas, curiosity, the desire to know about and explore the world, aspiration, so the motivation to drive yourself towards a goal. And finally, and I love this one, capacity for joy. It's so exciting to be talking about this. These are things that are often way down on our priority list. And the listening exercise has shown that we need to move it way back up the list. It's incredibly important.
Because like, those are the things that make life kind of worth living.
Right?
Absolutely. But how do we begin to foster those in children today? What are the key ways or the key pressures that we're currently facing that is really making that difficult? And Neil, I'm wondering whether you have some insights from the context of early education and where young people and especially young children are today.
I think we're starting to see the impact of children that were unable to explore the world. My mind flicks back to, obviously, the pandemic and the thought that many children were located within a very, very confined environment, whether it be a house, even worse if you were on the 16th floor of a high-rise tower block. And perhaps that's the reason at this particular point in time that we are starting to see in the early years more and more children come forward who have social and emotional developmental delays. And perhaps that's also the reason why government data just a few weeks ago highlighted that 11,625 children aged 5 and under received a exemption from school. And by that I mean that effectively they were excluded. Fixed term exclusions, over 11,000. And that, I feel, is because they were not given the opportunity to play and discover, to challenge, socialize, etc. A good example of how I think it should work is I went to Denmark to visit. I was invited to visit one of their big play equipment manufacturers. And they had a kindergarten on their site, on their manufacturing environment. And it was interesting. They had all of these wonderful, as you can imagine, slides and swings and you name it. It felt like I was at a fun fair. Not a single child in that kindergarten was playing on any of that equipment. They were playing in the pallets that they send that equipment out. The thing that really stood out for me is they were playing in a shopping trolley. And somebody said Iceland and Co-op are on the business task force.
They're here.
They're here, right. You're wonderful. No. One of the things you could do is you could donate one of those shopping trolleys to every preschool in the country. Because that's what they were doing. They were digging holes, they were playing with mud, etc. And I will never forget the comment from the manager when I left the setting. And she said to me in her perfect English, she said, "Neil, we promise parents 3 things when they come and pick up their children in the evening." She said, "We promise them their children will have had fun, they will be filthy, and they will be knackered." And I thought, and I still think, that is a fantastic recipe for developing children.
I think we could almost stop there, couldn't we? And parents will get a good night's sleep as well, so everybody's happy. So what about creativity, aspiration in the context of adversity, Bev, and especially structural inequality? How is there room for that? Where is the space for that, and how is it fostered, and what role can we do to it?
I think it's there's definitely room for capacity of joy and aspiration, and it's there actually in the firmament of the adversity itself, because sometimes the little children will develop some of the skills much quicker than others, like resilience, like adaptability, because things are so hard and tough. But also I think the way that we think about intervention is to think of the capabilities and capacities within the people around the child, the family around the child, the parent around the child, the family member around the child. In these spaces, if we take what is sort of referred to as a strength-based approach, we don't just look at the deficits that are around and the difficulties. We look at how are things being resolved on a day-to-day basis. How are you managing to manage on that little budget? How are you effectively seeking help? Because one of the biggest issues around vulnerability and poverty is that people that need the help most often don't seek it, get involved, more difficulties. So how do we sort of take a strength-based approach that looks at what are the strengths and the capacities in these exchanges and interactions we're seeing in the family? what is happening in terms of our interventionist professionals to tap into that and to sort of support those capabilities. You know, it's not always about, I'm going to say something here which some people might find controversial. It's always about spending money. It's about building those kind of connections and relationships, and then thinking about, if there is money, where should it go and who should be driving the changes? That's got to be the people living the experiences, managing the context of a difficult life. And then, you know, in terms of what we do across this space of people here, facilitating that. I always give an example. I live in the Black Country. I was born in London. My husband would never come to live in London, so I moved to the Black Country, a place called Wolverhampton, which I call home. And sometimes I come into London and I go and I meet all of these really, really sort of cutting-edge local authorities doing interesting work in early years and early help. And they talk to me about the sort of investments they get, you know, Google donates, et cetera, to a London community fund who are able to keep sustaining services. And I sort of say, well, you know, in my locality, we've got a place called Gill's Sausage Factory. And that's the industry. You know, we don't have the industry we used to have. We have a lot of poverty. But even Gill's donating to an under fives group, you know, equipment, sports gear, you know, it's a massive investment. So this is why I plead to very small businesses, please, you know, come into this space. Because that's the demonstration, you know, of the village, but also of the Ubuntu, you know, the idea that, you know, I am only me because of what you are. I am only me because of what you do. You know, and these are the things that we can do in terms of that space, Eamon. There's lots of capacity, there's lots of joy, you know, there's lots of strain as well. So we have to facilitate that with the approaches we take in terms of our systems of resources. And
so it's not just relationships, Bev, is it? That relationships happen in a context.
That's right.
They require resources. You need space to play. You need things to play with, even if it's pallets. And you need to
it's a recognition, but it's a recognition that within that space where it's very difficult, there is a lot of capacity
and motivation.
And an aspiration that may not be about what I don't want to offend anybody who's middle class, but I wasn't born middle class. I was born incredibly poor, and although I operate in the middle class setting, the idea of an aspiration is a difficult language. But the idea of just, you know, living a good life, you know, getting on well, having good friends, having a laugh, you know, having people that you can rely on, having somebody who can, you know, take the baby for half an hour because you feel like you're going to do something stupid if the baby doesn't go off for an half an hour because you've been in the stress of it all. These are the things that we can see, you know, in challenging some of that adversity. Those are the big things that we can do, but those are about governance and politics, and that's not for today.
Well, it might be later on. So thinking about you're now in a creative industry, and I imagine that growing up at 8 years old when you left that foster home, did you have a sense then of what you could achieve? Thinking about where did that aspiration come from, the creativity that must have driven you?
Yeah, well, for a long time, as touched on, I didn't have aspirations because of that survival pressure. And just a side point, you know, outcomes for looked after children compared to the broader public are really low still in terms of education, employment. And for a long time, I was on that trajectory. I had a social worker, I'm going to keep referring to my own story. I had a social worker in my mid-teens who got me a keyboard. And that was a game changer because I now had a creative outlet, you know, with my foster families. And actually there was a correlation between having that musical outlet and my academic attainment at school. And it wasn't something I particularly noticed at the time, but retrospectively I can say having a creative medium as a looked after child was so significant. And on that point of aspiration, you know, I'm kind of talking with my care leaver hat on. I believe that there is no cap on the potential of someone who's grown up in the care system. But for a long time, I felt the stigma and that cap of what I should do and who I could become.
And what you could do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I got to a point where I kind of tapped into my academic potential, got good GCSEs, and I decided that I wanted to go to Cambridge University. And I'm not saying that for clout. I'm saying that because it's really rare for a care leaver to want to go to Oxbridge or to go to Oxbridge rather. And I got invited to an open day. My social worker decided that she would take her Saturday off to take me. You know, she gave up her personal day to take me to an open day. That social worker went from being a professional to being an auntie figure. That intervention, that decision to go above and beyond to support me in my aspiration was so significant. I got into Cambridge, got my degree. But the point is, if she didn't take me to that open day, I wouldn't have applied to Cambridge, and I wouldn't be walking in what I would say is my potential academically. And so I think there's something really significant about taking a vulnerable young person and putting them in a space where they can dream big and see that their future could be far better than their start in life. And I'm so grateful that I had Rosalind to do that. And no doubt that there are countless professionals doing that for so many vulnerable young people.
That's really incredible, actually. And it's... because it's just so much more than the act of taking you, isn't it? It's for her believing that aspiration was completely valid and that she believed this was worthwhile, and that then gets imbued in you to feel, I can do this. People think this is possible.
And I think when a professional does their job well, for the young person, it doesn't feel like they're a professional.
Yeah.
It feels like they love you.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, just because somebody's being paid or not being paid, they're a human being. It's a relationship.
Yeah.
It's genuine. And it is clear that it can be incredibly formative. So I'm really conscious of time and the clock ticking. So I'm going to ask the panel just very briefly, maybe in 30 seconds or so, if I could put each of you on the spot. They're not really on the spot because I told them yesterday, but silly enough. To put you on put you on the spot, really tough. If you could pick, if just all of the things you've heard today, and if you could maybe think about the one social and emotional domain that's been most influential in your own life, and briefly why it's been so important, and maybe Sophie, I can start with you.
So I'm going to pick the self. So this covers a sense of agency as well as self-awareness. And I was very lucky that I had certain people in my life when I was very young who showed me, even if life gets really hard, there's something that you can do, right? You can put yourself in the driver's seat of your life and find a way through even difficult times. And we were laughing yesterday because I was like, well, I've just said yes to this panel in front of all these people and it's incredibly scary. But my sense of agency, my self-belief means that I'm willing to risk it. And it seems, gone okay.
It's gone brilliant, Sophie, brilliant. Neil, what would you say has been most formative for you?
I'm not sure how I would categorise it because I think it jumps between a couple, but maybe communication, but poor communication. And I recall when, and Ashley and I have very similar backgrounds in many ways, but I remember when my mum finally got us back out as a care home. I'm one of 6 children. That, like many families in the day, we were pretty poor. And my mum would get adult trousers and she would take them in to fit me. And my mum was the most loving, gentle person in my life, but she was the worst seamstress that you've ever seen, full stop. And I went off to school on this one particular day. I was 13 years of age. I know you're all looking at my trousers now, aren't you? And I had this really thick seam all the way down. And Mr. Fruin, my science teacher, pulled me out in front of class and made me stand in front of all my peers. And he said, Leitch, you are a disgrace. And the impact, looking back, is I hated school. That was the moment I wanted to get the hell out of it. So it's the reverse of what Ashley was alluding to. But the impact of that is that I will never forget, and I know this is secondary education, the power that we have to either shape a child's life or to destroy it. We, fortunately, shape children's lives. But that's probably the strongest point for me.
That's extraordinary. But thanks for sharing that, Neil, because it's so important to hold on to the challenges that children face when adults don't treat them well, and the powerful and damaging impact that can have. So we all have huge power that we need to deploy wisely and with true care. And when that doesn't happen, it takes a toll. Bev, what would you say?
When I say, well, I'm going to pick relationships.
Okay.
And just very briefly, I'm going to mention my auntie, Delcy, who saved my life as a young person. She stepped up and did the big thing as my teen carer. Going to say that she stepped up and did the big thing. In those days, there was absolutely no support around for those carers. But she taught me two really important things in terms of what I learned from her, an ability to accept others, to see different points of view, and to, in that sense, in my work, that turned into a little philosophy of mine, which is around tenderness, about how you are dealing sometimes with the most difficult and challenging circumstances of harm to children, and where you are having to call out, and I have called out, really bad acts sometimes that happen to children in parent-child relationships, but I never call out the person, because I remain with a level of being able to accept that there, but for the grace, any of us could be in this situation, and that then means that I had hope in the work and hope in the capacity for people to change. And I think that's why when we think about the early childhood being so important, but there is the hope of recovery later on in life.
Thanks,
That's
Bev.
fine.
Beautiful.
Very quickly, so I am a dad. I've been a dad for 3 years, but 2 girls, 3 and 1.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And prior to me being a dad, I would have said the individual characteristic, but I think now that I'm a dad, certainly emotions, I have to force myself to reflect on my emotions and how I perceive things, because, you know, there's that thing of not wanting to pass on anything, any residue of your past on to your kids. So I've had to develop a self-reflectiveness emotionally to be a better dad. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you.